From 2012 until late 2016, I sold American green cards under the United States EB-5 Immigrant Investor Program. If this is your first time hearing about the visa for sale industry, well, it might sound like a scam, it might sound shady or even illegal to you. But I can assure you, selling American green cards was very legal and was for a time a very profitable industry. In today's video, I will primarily be giving you a breakdown of what the EB-5 visa is, how it came to be, how it became a billion-dollar industry. This video is part 1 of 2. Once you have a basic understanding, I can give you a more thorough explanation of what working in the industry was actually like, especially during the huge, massive boom years that we experienced in the mid-2010s. If, after watching this video, you have any specific questions about the industry or something that you'd like me to clarify, please leave a comment in the comment section below, and I will address it in my follow-up video. This is a massive industry, and there's no way in hell that I could cover everything. But over the course of these 2 videos, I do want to share both the good and the bad of the industry. Everything from the fraudsters and the scammers that defrauded investors of millions and millions of dollars, to the governments that looked the other way, to the types of businesses and industries that were created using this program, and what the money actually looked like for the key players every step of the way in the EB-5 process. This is a very complicated topic. It involves complex immigration law, constantly evolving federal policies, individual state laws and regulations, massive numbers of diverse stakeholders, and more. Because of that, I will just try to stick to some very basic facts about the industry, as well as my experiences in the industry. But I will do my best to avoid getting too deeply into the weeds, as that would only serve to confuse most people, including myself. If you would like to do more reading about this topic, I have left a ton of links in the video description. I will try to be covering this topic honestly, but my memory of the times has begun to fade in the 6 years that I left the business. If there are any facts about projects, people, or the EB-5 program itself that are misstated or misrepresented, I do apologize in advance. The employment-based visa 5th preference category was created in 1990. The intent of the program was to attract foreign entrepreneurs who would directly invest in a small business. These foreign entrepreneurs were expected to manage the day-to-day operations of their small business, and they were expected to employ 10 American citizens. In exchange for these wealthy entrepreneurs leaving their country of origin, coming to the United States, investing in a small business, for taking this risk and investing in the United States of America, the entrepreneur and their immediate family would be given a green card. However, the program saw very little interest. After only a few years, Congress changed the EB-5 program from one aimed at attracting entrepreneurs engaging in small business to a program that would encourage hands-off investors instead via the Regional Center program, which we will get into later in this video. This change was primarily focused on attracting foreign investment to poor and rural areas. However, during this time, the EB-5 visa category continued to see very little interest overall. However, it did begin to attract the interest of money launderers and fraudsters, which resulted in the suspension of the EB-5 visa program for a brief period of time. Fraud is a recurring theme in the EB-5 visa world. Once the EB-5 visa program was reinstated, it still did not receive very much attention or many applicants until around the year 2010. The newfound interest in the EB-5 program primarily came from China. China's so-called economic miracle, fueled by rapidly growing real estate values and the rise of China's middle class, created a brand new market for the EB-5 program. Since the program's inception, the US government had set an upper limit of 10,000 EB-5 visas annually, and for the first 20 years of the EB-5 visa program, the number had never been close to being achieved. However, the new EB-5 consumer from China meant that in just a few short years, the annual limit of 10,000 visas would soon be far too small to meet the demand, and for a very brief time, it would create a feeding frenzy in the industry that is unlikely to ever be achieved again without significant reform. So what is an EB-5 visa, you might ask? Well, good thing, because I'm here to tell you. The EB-5 visa is an employment-based visa in the 5th preference category. As you can probably infer, there are other employment-based visas, including EB-1, EB-2, EB-3, EB-4, and yes, EB-5. The extremely simplified Cliff Notes version of the EB-5 visa is this. For each foreign investor, 10 American jobs will be created. If an investor can prove that they created 10 jobs in America, they would be granted legal permanent resident status in the United States for themselves and their immediate family. A slightly more complex explanation, but still quite simplified, is this. Immigrant investors at that time could invest either $500,000 US or $1 million US into a new or a distressed business that was already existing in exchange for an EB-5 visa and a conditional green card. A conditional green card, very quickly, just means it's not a permanent green card. It's conditional, it's temporary. You have to meet certain conditions, namely the conditions of the EB-5 visa. So let's keep going. The vast majority of EB-5 investors chose to invest the smaller amount, $500,000. There's a few key reasons for this. The first of which is that $500,000 is less than $1 million, so it's cheaper. In either scenario, the investment of either $500,000 or $1 million must be at risk. All other things being equal, most people would probably rather risk $500,000 as opposed to $1 million. The at-risk portion of the investment, the $500,000, it needed to be invested in either a new or a distressed business. And that business must create 10 new permanent jobs for American citizens, not counting the investor themselves or their immediate family. So for the smaller investment, $500,000, the business must be located in a targeted employment area. A T is designated in one of two ways. One, it's either a rural area, or two, it's an area with high unemployment. The investment must remain at risk while the investor has a conditional green card, generally about 2 years, but it could be much longer actually. So meaning the investor could potentially lose the entire amount of their investment. They cannot be promised any guaranteed return on their investment. Even if they were to lose their investment money, they can still obtain lawful permanent resident status in the United States of America. There is no obligation whatsoever for the investor or the entrepreneur to be good at business, to make money, to have a successful business. All they have to do is risk the money and have their business employ 10 people. Like I said, this is kind of complicated, but we're getting through it. Here we go. So now that we have a basic understanding of the EB-5 visa, next we're going to take a look at how it kind of really works. Again, this is not current. There have been some significant changes in the industry since I left the business, but this is how it operated when I worked there. So I've already mentioned that originally the EB-5 program was designed for entrepreneurs intending to work in their business and manage the day-to-day operations. However, the visa was not an attractive option, and it didn't attract many foreign applicants. The program was changed to attract investors as opposed to entrepreneurs. One of these changes meant that investors could invest in a regional center. This meant that instead of one investor and his family investing in a small business that they run by themselves, now investors can pool their money and they can invest in larger projects. So I'm going to create a hypothetical scenario in order to better explain this. Hypothetically, let's say that a developer wants to build a $50 million hotel in Chicago. They would like to secure funding through different means, including a tranche of EB-5 investors. So they might propose for their $50 million hotel, $20 million raised through the EB-5 program. In this scenario, what they would need to do is raise $20 million from 40 individual investors at $500,000 each. Almost all EB-5 investment from 2010 until clear up to 2019 was done through the Regional Center program. Investments just like this one. Now this type of project, this type of investment is ideal for the hypothetical developer. They get $20 million now, and that money needs to remain at risk to their investors for a period of generally at least 2 years, but possibly closer to 4 or 5 years. Again, this is because the investment has to remain at risk until the investor is granted legal permanent residence in the United States. This means after their conditional permanent residence, their conditional green card. So essentially what this means is that the developer receives a loan that they do not need to begin paying back for at least a few years. In practice, this means that through creative accounting, and because there's no guarantee of return on your investment, disreputable developers could get away with never repaying their EB-5 investors, or at least paying them pennies on the dollar when they do start paying them back. Theoretically, this kind of arrangement could also be good for the immigrant investor himself or herself. They pay $500,000 to invest in, let's say, a hotel project in Chicago, in the hypothetical scenario. They're hands off from the day-to-day operations of the business. They have no say whatsoever. They just give their money, while professional developers build the project and they secure a deal with a hotel operator, for example, let's say Hilton or Marriott, who comes in and brands the hotel, and you have a successful project. And hopefully, after a number of years, the investor not only receives a green card, but they start to receive return on their investment. In a scenario like this, where investors start to see a return on their investment and a hotel project is made, it's a win-win scenario for all stakeholders, from the US government, who gets increased tax revenue, to the developer, who basically gets a free or cheap money for their hotel, to the regional center, who collects fees, to the investor, who gets their green card and a return on their investment. But I can assure you that it often does not turn out this way. Sometimes it does. Well, now that we have a pretty solid understanding of what an EB-5 visa and investor would look like and what a potential project might look like, now we need to start filling in the rest. Let's start with what is a regional center. So according to USCIS, which is United States Customs and Immigration Services, an EB-5 regional center is an economic unit, public or private, in the United States that is involved with promoting economic growth. Regional centers are designated by USCIS for participation in the Immigrant Investor Program, the EB-5 program. These regional centers are what allows immigrant investors to pool their money for an EB-5 investment project. The regional center, after designating their geographic scope, either creates an EB-5 investment project themselves, or they allow third parties to designate the regional center as the representative regional center for their EB-5 project. For example, if I wanted to build a hotel using EB-5 funding pooled from 40 immigrant investors in Chicago, I would either create my own regional center, which can be expensive and time consuming, or I can contact these regional centers that are already operating in Chicago. I can pay them a fee or have my investors pay an administration fee to the regional center to sponsor my project. The regional center may already have applied for a targeted employment area that can be used, and they can also help me create a new T if I need one. So a good regional center, it might have an extensive track record of successful EB-5 projects with approved green cards for investors and return on investment for investors. That's a good regional center. These regional centers also likely already have an existing relationship with economists who create job reports for future EB-5 projects, and possibly with USCIS itself. So these existing relationships can also speed up the often very, very long and opaque EB-5 application process for the immigrant investor. So it's very important to invest with a good regional center. Targeted employment areas are areas in which the EB-5 immigrant investor can choose to invest only $500,000 instead of $1 million. Regional centers themselves will directly apply for a certain area to have a T designation. Ts are defined as either rural areas or areas with unemployment rates 150% of the national average. We're going to skip the rural designation here because almost no EB-5 projects are created in rural designated areas, generally speaking. Because America is complicated and every state in this union is able to set their own laws or their own criteria for designating a T, this information won't apply to every single T. However, in my experience, most states will allow applicants to select contiguous census tracts and then average the unemployment rate across these census tracts in order to designate their T. So what this means is that abuse or arguably outright fraud in the EB-5 world often will start right here. So here's one example, not of fraud, but let's just look at it. New York's world famous Hudson Yards project. This was funded in part via an EB-5 regional center. Obviously, Manhattan isn't a rural area, so we're gonna skip the rural designation of a T. What they needed to do was make this area economically distressed, an area with high unemployment. So what they did was they looked at the census tract map of the area, and they of course had to include the area where Hudson Yards would be located. And then they gerrymandered a new map of census tracts that economically and geographically do not necessarily make any sense, but it was in order to achieve their target unemployment rate. So let's say Hudson Yards area, for example, had normal unemployment rate, but there were some areas somewhere else in New York that had very high unemployment rates. So they make a contiguous map of census tracts, hopefully finding all the ones with high unemployment as they go. And then once they take them all together, they average them and they say, look, our targeted unemployment area is actually, it's a high unemployment area, even though where they're actually building Hudson Yards perhaps doesn't have high unemployment rate at all. By gerrymandering targeted employment areas, regional centers and EB-5 projects are able to say that, hey, this very expensive place full of wealthy people is actually an economically distressed area, so that's why we need foreign investment to come here and liven it up a little bit. Again, I want to be clear here. I'm not saying that this case in particular is fraud. It is well within the rules of the EB-5 program. However, I would argue that it is against the spirit of the rules. The EB-5 Regional Center program was supposed to help stimulate the economy, particularly for poor people and for people in rural areas. It was not supposed to be a program for creating what you could argue is a soulless playground for millionaires in Manhattan. There is no maximum number of census tracts that can be combined or gerrymandered in order to make a T. Many EB-5 Regional Center projects across the United States, they gerrymander their projects in exactly the same way. Not only that, but each investment is supposed to create 10 jobs. Again, I don't want to get super deep into the weeds here, but through the Regional Center program, you do not actually have to create these jobs directly. You do not even need to make a legitimate attempt to the USCIS to prove that these jobs were created. If an investor chooses not to use the regional center and they invest $1 million and they operate their own small business, these investors must prove they directly employed 10 people. But through the regional center program, you don't have that same obligation. So it's a smaller investment and the burden of proof is quite a bit easier to reach. So investing $1 million and employing 10 people, it's risky, it's hard, it's work. probably most investors aren't looking to do that. So this is another reason why the Regional Center program became super duper popular. With the Regional Center, what they do is they pay an economist who writes an economic impact report, who explains in using some math and some calculations, which are science-based, but they claim that the requisite number of jobs will be created. And they don't have to be direct jobs. So again, in the hypothetical scenario of $20 million from 40 investors who would need to come up with 400 jobs, in this scenario, the economic impact report from the economist would probably say something like, this hotel will create 200 direct jobs. These are employed by the hotel. And this project will also create 100 indirect jobs, which are jobs in the area. It will also create 100 induced jobs, which are jobs that wouldn't have existed if this hotel hadn't been built here. Whatever it is, they've come up with a report, hypothetically, that says there will be enough jobs created. And these jobs, these direct, indirect, and induced jobs, never at any point need to be proven to actually have been created to the USCIS in order for the investor to get their green card. So again, it's a much easier process than directly employing 10 people if you make a direct EB-5 investment of $1 million. And believe me, I'm not trying to be critical of the EB-5 program here. I'm just laying out the facts. Yes, jobs are created through this program. Yes, there is new tax revenue generated, new businesses are created, or distressed businesses are saved. There are clearly benefits from this program, but the geographical location of the EB-5 project is unlikely to meet the spirit of the EB-5 rules, and the jobs never have to actually be proven to be created in sufficient quantities to meet the legal requirements to give an investor his visa, but people are still able to build these projects and investors are still able to claim their legal permanent residence in the United States. To be really honest here, if developers were actually forced to comply with the stated intent of the program, they probably wouldn't be creating any of these projects, because tell me which rich developer, which huge hotel chain, which of these companies want to invest in a rural area, millions and millions of dollars, or invest in a ghetto or high unemployment area and employ people from this area? If they want to do that, they would, but they don't, so they don't. Why build in some rundown place when you can build a fancy hotel in Manhattan? Obviously, the choice is easy. So last thing we're gonna do today is quickly look at what kinds of investments foreign investors actually make through the program. There are tons of different types of projects, but some of the more popular things are senior citizens, assisted living facilities, urban mixed-use retail and office space, and hotels. In fact, a lot of the projects look suspiciously alike. In my opinion, this is for two reasons. The first one is that once a project is approved by the USCIS, this will give other developers and other regional centers a green light to go ahead with a similar project, because now they know that the USCIS has already accepted the economic impact report and the type of project that they want to create. In the early days of the program, when it really started to first take off, let's say the early 2010s, there was actually a lot of uncertainty on which projects would be approved, which investors would get their green cards. This was because there really was no track record for this whole EB-5 program. It was basically never really used. For a lot of investors, regional centers, stakeholders, it was always kind of a big pain in the butt, because you never really got any clear guidance from USCIS. The government seemed severely understaffed. They also seemed very reluctant to give definitive answers to stakeholders outside of, let's say, official adjudication of an application. So once a pioneer, let's call it, in a specific industry, in a specific regional center got an approval, other copycats would start to follow. Second, and probably more important, and what we'll talk about more in part 2 of this video, is that once you have an approved project or an approved type of project, it's a whole lot easier to sell future projects to other people. When you are trying to sell a project and you can point to a successful project and a successful regional center, and you can say, look, that one was approved, that one, the investor got a green card, so why don't you give me $500,000 now, and we can do the exact same thing. If you follow, let's say, like YouTubers who always want to sell you something, usually it's a confidence game, right? It's a con. And so they want to sell you something. They try to have proof, right? Social proof. And this is one way that people sell things to people. It's also a very successful strategy since the dawn of time to defraud somebody. And so when it comes to EB-5, there are a lot of very nefarious people who looked to defraud investors, especially, let's say, not very sophisticated investors and investors who were hands-off, which is what the EB-5 program became. So there was a lot of fraud, a lot of shady people, and people were conned out of millions and millions and millions of dollars. The biggest EB-5 fraud project that happened when I was in the industry was the hotel project in Chicago, Illinois. I never had anything to do with that project. Nothing I worked on had any relation to that project. But if you would like to learn about that project, there are a lot of very good articles about it. It's a very interesting story, and I might cover a little bit of it in the next video. Anyway, there's links to that story below, and I hope that you understood everything that I talked about today. If something was unclear and you want clarification, please leave a comment, ask me a question. If you would like me to answer a specific question about the industry and my work in it in the follow-up video, again, leave a comment. I do realize it's a very complex topic, and if you just want to know about working in China, you probably haven't made it all the way this far into the video, but the next video I'm going to talk about working in an EB-5 office in China. Whew. So leave a comment, and of course, like and subscribe and everything else.